I want to back up, if I could. I want to back up to their initial offensive. Right, it's been about a month since they launched that offensive around in the northeastern area. Before we get talking, because you're absolutely right. Eventually, we want to get to the hey, look, it's the 1960s all over again with the flotilla in Cuba. But talk to me about that initial offensive. How much of a surprise was it to both Ukraine, us, NATO, et cetera? And how successful were the Russians initially?
Initially, they gained some pretty good ground. I'd have to go back and look at the list of cities, but there's several cities that were in contention for months. And what the Russians did, it was quite brilliant. I mean, the Russians are brutal fighters. You know that, Mike. And what they did is they figured out there was a series of underground sewers, essentially, long pipes. And what they were doing to finally break the siege is actually sent special operations guys through these sewers to get into the rear area, come up and essentially kill the Ukrainians from behind. It was brilliant. I'm not judging. I'm just here to call balls and strikes. I'm just saying, as a military guy, that was pretty darn smart, and that broke the siege. Yeah. So they were able to get past the initial villages, but then they ran into very concerted, very established barriers. So one of the things the Ukrainians had done wisely is they recognized they were probably going to eventually lose this ground. And so they built layers of defense, much like the Russians did last year, Mike. The Russians had layers of defense which prevented the Ukrainian offensive from being successful. So the Ukrainians just, flipped the script and did the same thing. So that's why the Russians now, I think, are facing more concerted, effective, well-organized defense that they're going to have to go through and break down layer by layer. So that's why I think you see right now the delay, plus the rethinking of what does the change of strategy to allow the Ukrainians more freedom to use weapons against the interior of Russia.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at maps. Say you go back to the middle of 2023, and you look at a map of held territory, right, where both forces were, and then you look at a map from the end of May of this year. There hasn't been a lot of change, right? It's almost like World War I, right? Where you just there's no changes in the front lines, despite just the constant back and forth and the cost of this whole thing. So, to what degree, at that point where we started providing weaponry, and obviously there's a lag time, it's a logistical process, but to what degree has the approval of U.S. weaponry, and as you pointed out at the beginning of this, the willingness of the current administration in the U.S. to say you can strike certain targets, is it fair to say it's turned the tide, or is that a little bit too optimistic?
I think it's too optimistic. I think despite what the Biden administration said, Mike, there was no diminution of things. You point out correctly, I used to work as part of my covers in DOD as logistics, so I did learn kind of how logistics works. Things were in the pipeline all along, and simply because the funding wasn't there didn't mean the Pentagon stopped sending stuff. It was already there. So what you got to always take, besides Putin lying, the White House lies, especially Jake Sullivan. So Jake Sullivan was putting out this, we need the funding for XYZ. No. A lot of the companies who work with DOD, with the defense community, will continue to manufacture things knowing eventually they're going to get paid. And that's what happened here. So the weapons that were actually coming through the pipeline were actually coming through. I'll tell you this, one of the things that did upset the logistics chain was the bridge falling in Baltimore. This is little known, but at least 5 military Sea Lift Command ships, which had Ukrainian gear on them, was stuck in the port of Baltimore during that time. A large percentage, probably about 25 to 30% of U.S. military support for Ukraine, the heavy stuff, is shipped from the port of Baltimore via the U.S. military Sea Lift Command there. So that did have an effect, but that effect had nothing to do with budget.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you could argue. I'm not saying it was, but if it was a planned operation on the part of the FSB, that would be pretty damn clever.
But
it would. Again, not saying it. Not saying it was. I'm just saying.
I know. Look, I'm skeptical.
It shows the importance. It shows how small the world is. It shows how the supply chain, whether it's for military gear or not, can be impacted by just one event in one part of the globe.